Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 22nd of August of 2024. Today we have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about the Kursk direction. According to information we have, according to Vladimir Putin, the president of Russian Federation, during the previous night the Ukrainians attacked the nuclear power plant, Kursk power plant, with the FPV or different drones, but that attack was repelled, but this is obviously a very important signal. Furthermore, according to information that was discovered, the Ukrainians were planning to establish complete control over the Kursk power plant within the 7 days of their offensive. But as you can see, the Ukrainians haven't managed to pass even a 30% of this pass. Now let's talk about the situation on the ground, and let's start with the western direction. According to information we have, the Ukrainian forces entered the village of Komarovka. In this video that was published by the Russian sources, we can see very heavy clashes on the territory of the village. The Russian drone was flying above the village and hunting the Ukrainian tanks and vehicles that were located in the same area. And as a result of attacks, the Russians managed to destroy a significant number. Most likely, the Ukrainians will be able to introduce additional forces in this direction to push further in the western direction. And if we calculate the distance between possible Ukrainian positions in the village of Koryneva and the capital of this region, the village of Glushkovka, the distance between two positions is already less than 10 kilometers, which is very close, very close. As for Glushkova area, the Ukrainian sources continue publishing videos and updates of how they were bombing and attacking the bridges along the river of Seym. In this video we can see another bridge to the north of the city of the village of Zvane. So you can see Ukrainians still haven't started the ground offensive, but they want to be 100% sure that they destroy every single bridge, that they destroy the Russian logistic, and they want to be sure that when they begin the offensive, the Russians will not be able to introduce additional forces in this area. Now let's move further. According to different mappers, the Ukrainians establish complete control over the fields, tree lines, and the fortifications between the city of Koryneva and the village of Snagast. We're talking about these fields, yet we haven't received even a single geolocation that can confirm this, but this is the report from the Ukrainian sources. Now let's talk about the battle for Koryneva. The Ukrainians continue suffering significant losses. The only way how to continue offensive, they need to concentrate their forces in Matveyevka, in Olgovka, in Snagast. But the Russians, as you can see, continue publishing more and more videos of how they were attacking and FPV droning the Ukrainian vehicles. So for now, the situation develops not good for the Ukrainians. They are suffering significant losses, but without additional progress. Now the Ukrainians need to find a solution how to cross the river of Krepna and to enter the central and the western part of the stronghold. Now let's move further and let's talk about the villages, the triangle of villages Zhuravli, Kremanoye, and Sheptuchovka. The Ukrainian sources published very interesting video how they attacked and destroyed the Russian tank in this point. According to the map of Syrsky, these territories under complete Ukrainian control. But as you can see, the Russian tank was destroyed here, so most likely during the previous 24 hours, the Russians conducted an offensive operation with the purpose to cut the Ukrainians inside of Zhuravli and to create a cauldron or to destroy Ukrainian logistic for this small foothold to the north and the northwest of the village of Zhuravli. So we don't know for sure whether Russians managed to do this or not, but the tank obviously was destroyed. Now let's move further. Let's talk about the former women prison. The Ukrainians of 95th Brigade continue assault of this territory. During the previous 24 hours, we got significant number of videos of how the Ukrainians were FPV droning the Russian forces and the Russian positions in this area, but yet the Ukrainians haven't managed to get even 1 meter closer to the former women prison. If you remember, according to the map of Syrsky, the territory to the north of Malolokny was under complete Ukrainian control, but we continue receiving more and more updates and more geolocations that the map of Syrsky was wrong, or the Russians conducted a series of counterattacks and restored control over these villages. Now let's move to the village of Nechayev to the northeast of Ruskaya Porechnya. In this video we can see the Russian soldiers who raised the flag and reported that they managed to secure and to restore control over this village. I would like to point your attention on two important things. First of all, First of all, if you take a look at the map of any mapper, you won't be able to see during the entire Kursk offensive operation that the Ukrainians managed to enter the territory of this village. So I don't know how exactly the Ukrainians enter this area and how the Russians restore control over this territory. But another important thing that I would like to point to your attention is that the Russians, after very heavy clashes, after very bloody clashes with millions of the Ukrainians, managed to take a shower, managed to clean their faces, to clean their clothes, and they start making video completely clean as if they were fighting maybe a month ago. So something is wrong with this video, I think so, but let's wait maybe for additional updates, and we're gonna receive additional videos of how the Russians were fighting on the territory of the village and how they managed to stay clean with the clean clothes. Now let's move further and let's talk about the eastern flank, about Martinovka. Today some Russian sources reported, including the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation, that the Russians managed to repel attacks in the vicinity of Martinovka. So the Russians are trying to say that maybe they managed to restore control over this village during the clashes over the past 24 hours or something like this. For now we don't have enough of evidence or reports to make changes on the ground, so let's wait a little bit and maybe we will adjust the map in the very near future. And if the Russians did restore control over this village, obviously this is a very, very big problem for the Ukrainians. Now let's talk about Ruska Konopelka. As for geolocations, as for videos, currently we can make a conclusion that Ruska Konopelka is the main concentration of clashes between the Russian soldiers and the Ukrainian soldiers. Significant number of armored vehicles and personnel carriers were introduced by both sides. There are very heavy and close clashes within a very short distance between the Russians and the Ukrainians, and main clashes are taking place in the southwestern part of the village. As a result of clashes, the village was already reduced to ruins and most of the village was covered with fire. I'm not sure whether the Russians are able to hold their lines in this direction or not, but we can make a conclusion that due to the significant number of vehicles that Ukrainians have already introduced in this offensive, we can make a conclusion that Ukrainians will not count losses and they will move and push more and more. And the main purpose and the main goal of the armored forces of Ukraine is to force the Russian forces to fall back from this territory to the village, to the series, to the line of villages between Vorozhba, Semyonovka, Osipova Luka and Chorny Oleg. This will allow the Ukrainians to secure the lines, to improve their flanks and to start the concentration of the forces before the beginning the further offensive in the eastern direction. Another important thing we got from Sumy, according to information we have, Zelensky himself arrived in Sumy and he had a meeting with the Syrsky. They were talking a lot about the current situation, and the most important, as I understand, Zelensky brought to Syrsky the final orders and the final, let's say, instructions of what to do next. Because according to information we have, during the previous night the Ukrainians conducted a reconnaissance in force in the Bryansk area. They were using up to 200 soldiers and significant number of armored vehicles. That attack was repelled by the Russians, but it doesn't mean that the Russian lines are strong in this area. Maybe the Ukrainians decided to, let's say, retreat. The thing is that according to information we have, according to the group of forces north, the Ukrainians concentrated significant number of forces in the area of the responsibility of the northern group of forces. The Ukrainian armed forces have concentrated almost all available combat-ready troops of the strategic and operational reserves, most of the HIMARS systems, aviation and special operation forces. This is approximately up to a third of all combat-ready battalions from the total number of the Ukrainian armed forces and foreign volunteers and mercenaries. Significant number of forces, maybe 100, maybe 200,000 soldiers, but obviously there are a lot of Ukrainians, because we see that due to this concentration of forces and due to this maybe slow but more or less successful operation from the Ukrainian side, we see that Ukrainians continue suffering significant problems on every single other direction of the special military operation. And the most important area where the Ukrainians suffered the biggest losses is the Pokrovsk direction. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions. We got additional geolocations. Let's start from the northern part. According to information we have, the Russians continue their offensive offensive further in direction of the central and the northwestern part of Hrodivka, the Russians captured the street of Shkolne. So by the evening of the 22nd of August, the Russians managed to reach this line according to different sources. We are not changing the map because we are waiting for additional updates from more or less reliable resources, but anyway, I believe that this is exactly the situation on the ground. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to discover and to destroy additional vehicles and tanks in this area. There is just one road that Ukrainians use to supply the city, and obviously this road is already under complete fire control. I believe that we can start counting days when the Hrodivka is going to fall. As for the city of Novohrodivka, according to information we have, the Russians answered the city from two directions, from the eastern direction, and the Russians answered the city from the southeastern direction. As you can see, the Russians are trying to take the village city in pincers. There are very heavy clashes, and once again we also received a number of videos of how the Russians were FPV droning the Ukrainian forces on the territory of the city. We see no resistance. The most important, the Russian drones are flying about above towns and cities without any let's say electronic warfare resistance from the Ukrainian side, which confirms that the Russians are feeling themselves pretty comfortable in this area. During the previous 24 hours, we have adjusted the map significantly in Ukrainian favor. As a result of clashes, we have colored the village of Mizhovo, Skuchne, Ptiche under complete Russian control. According to the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, as a result of active actions, units of the Group of Forces Center managed to establish complete control over Mizhovo and secure this area. Furthermore, the Russian sources published the video with the Russian flag in the central part of Ptiche. This video confirms at least the presence of the Russian soldiers. We can't say whether the Russians have secured and established complete control over the territory, but obviously there is a presence of the Russians. Furthermore, the Ukrainians are retreating towards Kalinova, and the Russians are moving right after them. And we see that the Russian FPV drone focus is also moving with the Russian army. Now, according to geolocations, the Russians are focused on this stronghold. During the previous 24 hours, we got at least 2 geolocations and significant number of vehicles that were destroyed around this stronghold, which confirms that this is a very small operational target of the armored force of Russian Federation to move further in the southern direction along M30 road. Once again, as we discussed in the previous updates, most likely by the end of this week, by Sunday, the Russians will be able to establish complete control over every single city and village and stronghold, fortification, water barrier, and many other different facilities and infrastructural objects to the M30 road between the current positions and this line. Of course, it's very difficult to understand what the Russians are going to do next, but by this time I believe that we're going to receive additional updates from Novohrodivka and Hrodivka themselves, and maybe nothing can stop the Russians after the fall of Hrodivka to move further in direction of Mirgorod, because in this case the distance between two cities is going to be less than around 5 kilometers. Now let's move further. Let's talk about Krasnogorovka, because today, for the first time since the Battle of Krasnogorovka, we received the video of how the Russians were established complete control over the main supply road between the territory that led from Krasnogorovka under complete Ukraine control and the mainland. And this is very interesting. This road is no longer safe for the Ukrainians. The Russians established complete FPV drone control over this territory, and this can mean just few things. Either the Ukrainians will fall back in the very near future, or they will stay there and they will stay there forever. Now let's move further. As you can see, during the previous 24 hours we haven't received anything from the South Donetsk direction. Most likely there are very heavy clashes, but we haven't received any reports. As for Toretsk, New York agglomeration, we still haven't received anything regarding the situation in the industrial zone in the heart of New York. According to pro-Ukrainian sources, there are still Ukrainian soldiers who are currently defending their positions, and if maybe this is the reason why we haven't received any reports from Nilipovka, because basically the Russians are not available to move further in the northern direction until they secure the industrial zone. zone. So maybe something like this. As for Toretsk itself, the city is under very heavy fire. The Russians are bombing. The Russians continue offensive operation, securing operation, and today we have additional changes on the ground. The Ukrainian sources published the video of how they were FPV droning the Russians in this point, and based on this video we have adjusted the map in this area, and the Ukrainian sources published the video of how they were bombing the Russians in this point, and based on this video we have adjusted this part. So as you can see, as for the end of the 22nd of August, the Russians established control over more than 60-70% of Druzhba, and also few days, and the village of Druzhba will be captured, and then the Russians will be able to move further along the railways towards the city of Konstantinovka, trying to avoid, let's say, straight clashes and with the Ukrainians in Toretsk. And if the Russians are able to get this point, then obviously they will be able to cut the last supply that goes to the city of Toretsk, and this is going to be complete disaster for the Ukrainians. As for Chasiv Yar and Klishchevka direction, during the previous 24 hours we got the video from Klishchevka area that was published by the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians were FPV droning the Russian soldiers, which confirms Russian control over this stronghold. Based on this video we have adjusted this part. Most likely this stronghold was also captured by the Russians, and as you can see, the battle for Klishchevka is coming to the analogical end, where the Russians will establish complete control over the territory along the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass canal. Also we have additional report from Chasiv Yar. The Russians managed to improve their positions a little bit. In this video that was published by the Russians, we can see two Russian soldiers that were moving along the streets of Chasiv Yar, and at some point they managed to discover the positions of the Ukrainians, and they captured probably 3 or 4 Ukrainians exactly in this building. Based on this video we have adjusted the map in Russian favor. As for Siver's direction, we haven't received anything important, just regular activity, artillery and missile strikes conducted by the Russians during the previous day. The same story we can say about the southern Kupiansk direction, just a number of vehicles, armored vehicles that were destroyed by the Russians as a result of fire. And the same story in the northern Kupiansk direction, as number of FPV drone strikes on Ukrainian vehicles, let's say collapse of Ukrainian logistics, significant losses, but as you can see, without any changes on the ground. Most likely the Russians have redeployed their forces and troopers from the northern Kupiansk, from the Siversk direction, to Kursk area with the purpose to stabilize the situation and not to allow the Ukrainians to improve their positions or introduce additional forces that can attack further and much deeper on the territory of Russian Federation. As for Zaporozhye direction, we haven't received anything special, just regular activity, very heavy clashes, FPV drone strikes, but without any changes on the ground. As for the possible Ukrainian offensive operation in Zaporozhye direction that we discussed a few days ago, the Ukrainians still haven't started anything. The Russians continue improving their defense belt along the Crimean Bridge. Today we got reports that Ukrainians destroyed some ports, some infrastructure in this area, that Ukrainians are planning to attack the Crimean Bridge as well. And as for massive missile strikes, according to information we have, and different countries have already announced and asked civilians from the United States of America, from different countries, from China as well, to be very safe, to find a safe place in Kiev during the 24th of August, during the Ukrainian day, and because the Russians during this upcoming weekend Russia is planning to conduct massive missile strike. The Ukrainians are doing all their best to avoid the situation. For example, today the Ukrainian sources published the video how they attack another Russian airfield in the vicinity of Prikonalny. This is the airport that the Russians were using to attack the territory of Ukraine with cruise missiles and so on. As you can see, there were very heavy explosions, the warehouses were destroyed, maybe some aircrafts were damaged, lots of video were published. So the Ukrainians are trying to destroy the Russian aviation infrastructure and not to allow the Russians to attack the territory of Ukraine during the 24th of August, because obviously this is going to be a very powerful attack, probably the biggest attack ever, and most likely the Ukrainians will be completely turned off from the energy supply, and they're going to be the longest blackout ever. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.